Hello and good morning. Welcome to Mama Mondays. Today we're going to be looking at SCOBY Hotel maintenance. But first, I wanted to show you how our other batch of kombucha is coming along. So earlier in this week, I had brewed up this batch of kombucha here. All right, figuring out how to use this camera. So hopefully you can see that. We can see we've got new SCOBY growth here. That's the really white stuff coming in on top. The mother is here with the yeast strands hanging down. You notice I have a little heater on it, and that's just because even though we're in Southern California, it gets cool here, and we have cool countertops. So that's coming along nicely. I'll be looking forward to trying that soon and moving it to the next stage of flavoring. So that was our little check-in. Now we're going to look at our SCOBY Hotel maintenance. So hi, nice to see you, Veronica. Thanks for being here. So I have the SCOBY Hotel that I have let sit for a little bit of time. Let's see if I can angle this here so you can see it a little bit better. And literally last week after I put the heater on it, I noticed that it grew a little bit of mold. This is unusual, yet something that can happen. Now, in reality, this hotel has been sitting for a really long time. And as you can see, there's not that much. I mean, there's still some liquid here, but it's not very robust. And so it's a great reminder that we also need to maintain our hotels. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So today I'm not going to be maintaining this one. I'll actually be tossing it because we don't want to keep anything that has mold. Hi, green. But it's a great example of sometimes this can happen, and this is why we keep a hotel in the first place. Now, obviously, you saw I already have another batch of kombucha brewing, so I already have an extra culture that is going to be my backup. Now, when you have a hotel like this, and maybe you have ignored it, I feel like I just saw a great question about this. Someone was just saying they're in quarantine, they haven't really touched their kombucha. And so the best thing to do is not to just go ahead and start a new batch right away, because if the kombucha's been hanging out for a while in its hotel, it might have gone a little dormant. So while the bacterial cellulose, which is what makes up our SCOBY, and you know what, I'm going to take this one out just so we can look at it a little bit more closely. So sanitation wise, you want to make sure you wash your hands. You can also some people like to do a little vinegar on their hands. I'm an old hand at this, so I am perfectly comfortable using my own hands to tackle it. So here we can see this is the new layer that grew, and then look at this. So what's kind of neat about this is we get to look at the mold, which is really difficult. You know, it's so funny. When we were writing our book, it was so hard to get those mold pictures because our cultures are so robust. But this one has been sitting for a really long time. So you see how this is, you know, it's black, right? And it's got those concentric circles. And if we touch it, it's gonna leave a powdery residue on the finger. This is how you know if it's mold or not, because we can have lots of, you know, weird looking stuff on a SCOBY. But if it doesn't leave that powdery residue, then it may not be mold. So I'm gonna rinse my hands now. Get that yucky mold off. And remember, the mold on here is food mold, right? So just like sometimes you might pinch some off of bread or cheese and just go ahead and eat it, we just don't do that with kombucha because a lot of folks have immunocompromised systems, and we want to make sure that we're making the best, healthiest product we can. So some of you might be thinking, well, can't we just salvage the SCOBY underneath because it looks fine? We just don't like to do that because the mold spores, even though they're only on this top layer, they could potentially penetrate into the other layers. And it's no fun spending that time and energy brewing up a fresh batch of kombucha only to find it's gone to mold again. So we always want to make sure we're using a culture that hasn't touched any mold at all in order to make our brew. That's just our safest, healthiest way to make kombucha. But for maintenance of a hotel, so let's say this was your hotel and it didn't have mold, but it doesn't have very much liquid. So what do we want to do? Rather than take the SCOBY and start a new batch entirely, the first thing we want to do is maybe just make a small bit of sweet tea. So you could even just use a single tea bag and in a teacup, just like you brew a cup of tea to enjoy at home. You definitely want to put some sugar in there. and then you just pour that on top of your brew. Give it a couple of days, wait until you notice some new growth starting, and that's going to indicate, okay, now it's ready, now I can take the new growth out and start with that. You certainly could also keep one of the older Scobys with it, but typically we want to just make sure that it's going to reproduce and not go to mold before we start a new batch with it. So the best way to do that, make a small amount of sweet tea, pour it into your vessel, give it a couple of days, and once you see that new layer forming, then you know you're good to go. I've got yeast on my hands, so I'm just gonna wipe that off. All right, so we have a really great post on our website, kombuchacamp.com. If you type in hotel in the search bar, it'll take you right to it. There's gonna be a video that shows you how to set it up. Literally, it's just a jar with Scobys and liquid. And then we also have some maintenance information. So that's what I wanna go over with you today. So the first thing we wanna do when we're maintaining a hotel is to take out all of the cultures and set them aside. Then, because as we can see, this liquid it's not very clear, it's cloudy, it's opaque, we're gonna wanna strain it to get rid of any yeast. So let me show you how I do that. I'm just gonna grab my pitcher here and a sieve. And we're just gonna give it a good strain. So now I'm just gonna pour this liquid through the sieve, because that's going to catch any big pieces of yeast. And it's going to leave behind liquid that's a little bit clearer. So we can even see there's still some sort of stuck at the bottom of the jar, and so we're going to give this a nice rinse as well. So I'm going to just move this SCOBY aside. And notice this SCOBY has a hole in it, and you know what? That's perfectly fine. It's still going to brew up a delicious batch of kombucha. So here we can see the yeast that's been left behind. Now, sometimes when we have a lot of yeast, like when we're cleaning out our continuous brew or something like that, we can even save this yeast. We might put it into the fridge with a little bit of liquid and let that slurry sort of continue to grow, and then we can add that to flour and make a kombucha sourdough. So kombucha yeast is different from traditional baker's yeast, and it's going to end up with a kind of a sourer flavor, if you will, a little bit more density to the texture. But we can collect the yeast in the fridge, save it there, and then use it for making our own sourdough if we desire to do that. So, but these yeasty beasties, we're just gonna rinse these out, flush them down the drain, and then this liquid is, as we can see, it's a little bit clearer. It's not quite as cloudy or opaque. And again, this isn't very much liquid, so so if we were starting a batch, maybe we would start a smaller batch, a half batch or something like that, just so that way we're making good use of the liquid we have. So now that we've rinsed everything, or sorry, strained everything, the thing we want to do is just rinse out our jar so that we can reuse it. It's going to be pretty straightforward. I've just poured water in it. I'm just swirling it around. Yes, we certainly could use, since there's been mold in here, the best thing for us to do is just going to be to add a little bit of distilled vinegar. Do not add apple cider vinegar. Why? Because, especially if it's raw or living, it can have what are called vinegar eels. And they're actually a little nematode. They're non-toxic to humans, and in fact, you know, they're even permitted in the production of vinegar as long as they're not in the final product to the consumer. Again, even as a consumer, if you were to drink vinegar eels, it would not have a negative impact on your body because they're not toxic to humans. However, they feast on bacterial cellulose, this stuff here. So if you had vinegar eels, they'd be eating your Scobys, and it will kill them. And an infestation is just not fun to have to clean out, etc. So in an ideal world, we leave the raw apple cider vinegar for its medicinal uses, for salad dressings, for all the other great ways we can use it. And then we only use distilled or pasteurized vinegar to clean out our kombucha brewing vessels. So stay away from the ACV. When you get vinegar eels, it's going to be difficult to notice at first because you have to have several of them reproduce until there's sort of like this seething mass. You can go to YouTube and Google vinegar eels, because a lot of people actually raise them to feed fish, to feed baby fish. So they do have a great purpose, just not in our kombucha vessel. So you can check it out, see what those look like. We want to avoid them at all costs. So our jar is not looking super great, especially because we have that little bit of mold. So I'm just going to come back over here and with that little bit of vinegar, give it a good rinse and make sure everything is looking pretty clean. And now that it is, we can just go ahead and reuse our jar in order to make our next batch of brew. So let's go over those steps again. We took out the cultures from the hotel and set them aside. In this case, I was able to put them on a plate. You might need to put them in a bowl, just depending on how many you have. From there, we filtered the liquid through a sieve in order to remove some of the larger yeast bits. We talked about the things we could do with those yeast bits if we want, or we can simply rinse them down the drain. From there, now we have what's remaining here is potent starter liquid. So this starter liquid can be used to start a new batch. Now again, we want 1 cup per gallon, so this might be just enough to start a gallon of kombucha, or we might do a smaller batch just to make sure that what we're creating is robust and has enough of a starter liquid so that the pH can drop quickly, and that's what's going to prevent mold from growing in the next batch. From there, we have rinsed our hotel with warm water and some vinegar to make sure that it's nice and clean. But again, we're avoiding the apple cider vinegar and we're using the distilled vinegar only. Once we've done all of that, we might want to take a look at our Scobys and maybe trim them or thin them, depending on how many we have here. So we know this top layer is no bueno, because we've seen the mold here is no good. So we definitely want to throw that away. And so we can see we have a somewhat nice layer underneath. Again, just to be safe, we're not going to keep or start any new batches with these because we don't want to pass on any spores that are here. So there's many things we can do with this. I'm probably going to toss this in my garden and let it compost. That's then going to just help the soil have more bacteria richness to it. You can also throw it in the garbage. Maybe it's going to help break down the landfill. So we really feel like even if we have to throw our Scobys away, we're not wasting anything because it gets broken down and can go back into nature. So just looking at our Scobys here, we see we've got nice bits of yeast on here. We tend to prefer not to rinse our Scobys because we want this natural colony of bacteria and yeast. Only if I saw like massive clumps of yeast would I feel like, okay, let me pinch a little bit of it off. Like I could pinch some of this yeast off here, just if I wanted to not have so much. But really, this looks beautiful. This would be a great Scoby you'd want to keep and reuse. This one is a little bit of an older one. It's a little bit thicker. Here we can see it's turned a little darker because of the tannins in the tea. So it isn't as, see how much lighter in color this one is? That's because this one was the original Scoby. So it's been exposed to tea for longer, which gives it that darker color. And you can feel like, even with this hole in it, it's very resilient. It's very dense. I cannot get my fingers through this. And that is our sign of really healthy culture. Again, this one has a bit more yeast on the back, so I wouldn't want to rinse it, but I might, again, just pinch off some bits of yeast so that way it's a little less yeasty and there's more of that balance there. Now, the other thing we can do is if this is too large is we can trim it with scissors. So let me just rinse my hands. Get out our scissors. So there is a myth about kombucha that the cultures are afraid of metal or cannot touch metal. And this piece of advice was really valuable at a time when we didn't have the internet, when we relied on just a small slip of paper of someone telling us what to do with our culture. The reality is that the kombucha culture is a really strong detoxifier, which means when we put it into an environment, it's going to pull toxins from that environment, which is what it's doing inside of our bodies. That's great. It's not so great if we're putting it into vessels such as things that might have a leaded glaze or aluminum. But that said, so the lesson here is don't just grab a vessel from a secondhand thrift store unless you're confident it's for food use and test lead free.